One of the best known of Jesus' commands is to love your neighbor as yourself. Interestingly, though people who aren't really even religious sometimes know this command, it's a command that is not oftentimes explained. So what does Jesus mean when he says to love your neighbor as yourself? How does that impact us in an everyday situation? This morning, what I'd like for us to consider is the idea of this command in its context. And so I would encourage you that if you have your Bible handy, to go ahead and look to Matthew chapter 22, and we'll see what the Lord had to say, and to understand in context exactly what all this command entails. As we think about the setup for this particular command, Jesus has gone through a number of different conflicts with people. In fact, if you look in chapter 22, just scanning the page, you'll see that the Pharisees have tried to trap him in a question on taxes. You'll see that the Sadducees have tried to trap him in a question on marriage and the resurrection. And following that, a man comes to Jesus and asks him, what is the greatest command? What's interesting about this is that without missing a beat, Jesus immediately answers that. He doesn't stop and say, well, there's just so many important commands. There's just so many great commands. No, he immediately tells the man the answer to his question. And in verse 37, this is what the Lord has to say. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. With this answer, the man's question has been satisfied. But if you'll note in the text, Jesus isn't finished, because he wants the man to understand that in association with this great command, there's other things that must also be understood. And thus he continues. And he says in verse 38, this is the great and first command, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. As we consider Jesus' complete answer of answering the greatest command, but also explaining things that must be understood, one of the first things we notice about his answer is this, that he actually talks about three different kinds of love. The first of these, he says, is you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. I want you to notice, though, how Jesus explains this command. He follows it by saying, it is the great and first command. We understand by the usage of the term first, it doesn't mean this is the first command that was spoken in the Bible. We know there were several that came before that, even going back to the Garden of Eden. But he says, this is the primary, this is the foremost command. Everything else is going to flow from it. So he says to the man, in answer to your question, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind is where it begins. It's the great and the first commandment. Isn't it also interesting that in Jesus calling this the first commandment, that it differs from the first commandment of the 10 Commandments? You'll recall that as God gave the list of the 10 Commandments, he says in the first part of that, there are to be no other gods before you. You are to serve me exclusively. I want you to note the difference in these two commands, though they are both connected, certainly, and both applicable and joined. God wants us to understand that serving Him is much more than simply a recognition of His power. When He says, you are to have no other gods before me, He's not acknowledging there that there's other deities in the world. The term there means power. You're to have no other powers before me. And you can think about this as he explained it to a people who had just come out of the land of Egypt, one of the most polytheistic of nations. It was there that they worshiped the sun. It was there they worshiped the Nile. It was there they worshiped all manner of four-footed creatures. And God says to the people, you are to serve me exclusively. You are to have no other powers, no worshiping the sun, no worshiping the Pharaoh, no worshiping the Nile. I alone am the power you serve. Yet the commandment that Jesus chooses here shows us a connection far beyond simply a recognition of power. It's loving that power. And so he says the most important, the primary thing you must do is to love this power, to love Yahweh God with all you've got. And as he explains this to the children of Israel, almost everything we find in the commands that they're given flow from this idea. And almost every time in the Old Testament where we come across this idea of loving God with heart, soul, and mind, it's almost always connected with obedience to God. We're not going to spend a long time in this lesson exploring these, but let me just give you a sampling of those passages. Most of them are found in the book of Deuteronomy, and in chapter 11, verse 1, the Lord says, you shall therefore love the Lord your God and keep His charge, His statutes, His rules, and His commandments always. How do you show your love for me, God says? It's by showing your loving obedience to me. Just a few verses down, he says, if you will obey my commandments that I command you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve Him with all your heart and with all your soul. In chapter 13 and verse 3, he says, you shall not listen to the words of the prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. And finally, he says in chapter 30 and verse 6, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and that you may live. All of these passages in the book of Deuteronomy are connecting loving the Lord with obedience to His commands, but it doesn't stop there. Let me show you just a couple of more outside of the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Joshua, as Joshua is giving his valedictory address, he says, only be careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord and to walk in all His ways and keep His commandments and to cling to Him and to serve Him with all your heart and with all your soul. And finally, in the book of Psalms, we find it very succinctly stated, O you who love the Lord, hate evil. How do we show our love for God? It's by an obedience to His commands. It's by showing that unlike the pagans, our obedience comes from love, not out of fear for God. There will be no one who goes to heaven exclusively because they're scared of going to hell. Hell is a good starting motivation for us. It shows us where we don't want to be. But the one who reaches spiritual maturity, the one who will be opened and welcomed into heaven, will be the person who has loved the Lord and shown that love through his obedience to God. What does a pagan do? A pagan worries about what an angry God will call down. Will it flood? Will there be a drought? Will there be sickness? Will there be pestilence? All these different things the pagan fears, whereas the child of God says, come what may, I'm going to obey because I love God. And unlike the pagans, this service will not be given in ritual. It's not the idea that I'm going to do this so that God will bless me in some kind of physical way. It's obeying those commands because in so doing, we show the Lord that we're all in, that we trust Him, that we love Him, that we want a relationship with Him. The true love given to Yahweh, to Jehovah God, is a love that is given through obedient service because of that desire for a relationship with Him. And it's that love that transforms our mind. That no longer we think in strictly human terms. No longer do we think like a pagan would think. In fact, the Apostle Paul put it this way when he said, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." Why? That by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Through the love of God and a transformed mind, it means that we are faithful to Him. The second love, then, is the love of neighbor. And again, here is where we begin to put this command in context, because the Lord did not leave this just simply stating, love your neighbor as yourself. Just like the earlier command, He followed this with a commentary also. He says the second like it. Here He says, when you love the Lord your God, there's another command that must be considered that is like the first one. And what He's showing in that is that these two commands are indelibly linked together. There is no separating them. So what does that mean? Simply put, it means one cannot love God and hate a neighbor. That's impossible to do. One must understand that loving a neighbor demonstrates that all-in love for God. God says, you want to show that you love me? You want to demonstrate the love that you have for me? That's going to be evidenced in the love that you have for your neighbor. We'll be back to that point a little bit later. But let's look at the third love. Here He says, you are to love your neighbor as you love yourself. There is a difference here. It is here that Jesus does not command this kind of love, but rather He assumes it. When He says you are to love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus is saying to us, okay, I understand that you have a love for yourself, and based on that, you're to love your neighbor. That, however, leaves us in a little bit of a dilemma, at least on the surface. Here Jesus has said not only to love your neighbor, but He's also said it's the second great command, and He's also said it's linked to loving your God. But yet, if we turn just a few pages over in our New Testament, we find the Apostle Paul saying this. But understand that in the last days, there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, who have the appearance of godliness, but deny its power. So which is it? Here Jesus says, you are to love your neighbor as yourself. Here it is linked to the second great command. But yet to Timothy, Paul says, you're going to know that times are going to get worse because there will be people who love self. Well, as many things in the Bible, what may appear to be a contradiction on the surface is pretty easily explained as we dig down deeper into the text. When Jesus talks about loving oneself, it is a self-love that is based on the love of God. When Paul talks about loving self, it's a self-love where the love of God is not present at all. Here is someone who is not linking the commands together. Here is someone who is saying, I'm going to leave God out of the equation, and I'm going to put myself in the number one position. What we must understand is that that kind of self-love is always a danger. In fact, we can see it in two different ways. We understand that someone who is trying to be in charge of the show can easily be built up in pride. Someone who says, I don't need God. I've got all the answers. I don't have to consult His Word. I know what's right and what's best. That can be a very big problem for anybody, but it can be a big problem for Christians. Over the past 2,000 years, there have been so many people who've said, I've got a great idea. But they never take the time to fully and truthfully compare that great idea to what God says in His Bible. There are also people outside of the religious world who say, I have no need of God. I am running the show. To those people, the psalmist says, in the pride of his face, the wicked does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. Whenever we hear someone credit evolution or some cosmic accident in order to explain that there is no God, this psalmist is speaking, calling out to that person for a change of heart. When someone says, well, I can't understand how a good God would allow, well, there may be room for doubts within the faith of God. But those doubts need to be answered through His Word. For someone simply to write God off and say, I can't believe that a good God would, this psalmist is talking to that person. When we love ourselves without the love of God, what we are doing is putting ourselves in a very prideful situation. But I'd also like to bring this out also. Sometimes it can bring us to look like we have no value. And those things look so totally opposite. But consider this thought. Here is someone who says, for whatever reason, I'm not this, and I'm not that, and I can't do this, and I can't do that. And I look at all these other people, and they can do these things, and I have no value. Oftentimes what happens then is the dismissal of God. Why would God do this to me? Why would God not answer this prayer? And so writing God off is an act of self-love. It's the idea of preserving ourselves, of saying, I can't wrap my mind around why God would allow this to happen to me. Therefore, I'm just simply not going to believe in Him. That's also a side of self-love. Or even taking that to the extreme, where someone takes one's own life, it's saying, I'm going to protect myself. Well, what has someone in this situation forgotten? Again, we turn to the psalmist. And in Psalm 139, the psalmist says, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. The psalmist says, we have value. That we are a people who are made in the image of God, fearfully and wonderfully made. So whether it be pride or another aspect of pride where we say, I'm not going to allow God or anybody else to hurt me, we understand that trying to have a self-love without the love of God is always going to leave us in a very bad position. So what does that mean? As Jesus speaks about loving our neighbor as ourselves, He's saying, as you do good for yourself based on the love of God, you do good for your neighbor. And we understand that doing what's best for self involves a lot of things. It involves caring for the physical body. Ephesians 5:29 brings that out, where he says a man cherishes his own flesh. He does nothing to harm it. And so we take care of our physical body just like we would take care of a tool. God has given this body as the vehicle for the soul. And just as we wouldn't leave our rakes and our shovels lying about in the yard to be damaged by rain and rust or to be destroyed in some way, we take care of this tool. But so much more than that. Loving self is taking care of the soul. And in this we once again turn to the Apostle Paul to make the point, where he writes to Timothy and he says, for while bodily training is of some value, we need to take care of this body, feed it well, exercise it, make sure it's in the best shape we can get it in. He says, that's good, that has some value. But godliness is of value in every way as it holds for the present life and also for the life to come. So when Jesus makes the assumption, you love your neighbor as you love yourself, what He's saying is you are treating your neighbor in such a way that your neighbor is going to be cared for just like you would care for yourself in that understanding based on God's love. Let's take all three of these ideas and put them together now. Three different kinds of love. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. And as we join all of these together, let's talk about, just in general, first of all, the concept of biblical love. When God talks about love within the Bible, He is not talking about something that is strictly based on emotions, something that's shallow and better felt than we can explain it. That's not it at all. In biblical terms, love is always a choice. And to understand the greatest of these commands, we first understand that God made the choice to love us. In fact, perhaps the best known passage in the Bible explains this very thing. For God so loved the world. Oftentimes in the Gospel of John, the world is presented in a very negative way. But here God says, I love the world enough to give my Son so that whoever would believe in Him would not perish, but have eternal life. That is the highest form of love that one can choose to give. And we also understand that Jesus chose to love us. The apostle wrote to the Philippians and he said concerning Jesus, He emptied Himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even the death on a cross. Jesus chose to love the Father and to honor the Father by coming to earth. Jesus chose to love us by giving Himself for us. We see in the Godhead the highest form of love that one can choose to give. And based on that, we then understand that God's choice of loving us produces within us this self-love that is based on His selfless love. So because God chose to love me, I can understand something about myself. I can understand how God views me, and my worth is then viewed through the lens of how God views me. What did the apostle say about that? He said, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. We oftentimes focus on the first part of this verse, which is so important, but let's not fail to include the latter part where he says the reason that all of this happened is because God loved me. And because of that love, He gave Himself for me. God chose to show me the highest form of love. Jesus chose to show me the highest form of love. And then I realize that as I look at myself through the eyes of God, to Him I have value and I have worth, and it's not based on anything that's going on in this life. God is not punishing me necessarily when something bad happens. But God is saying, I have demonstrated my great love to you in giving you Jesus Christ on the cross. If anyone should view oneself in a prideful way, this should bring the humility needed. Conversely, if someone views oneself as worthless, valueless, that person has not looked to how God is viewing the situation. No, God says, I want you to understand something about yourself. I loved you enough to give my Son. Jesus says, I loved you enough to die that terrible, terrible death for your salvation. And when I understand that, when I understand that He put on flesh for me, I then put on the flesh of my neighbor. And simply meaning by that, I love my neighbor as I love myself. Someone who has value and worth, not because of anything I've done, but because God sees within me worth. Because God sees within me value. Therefore, I turn to my neighbor and I say, as God has now shown me His love and shown me how I need to view myself, now I view you as someone who has value and someone who has worth. And that then leads me to treat my neighbor in the very best possible way. Romans 13 explains it like this: owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Notice what Paul says here. He says, you don't dishonor your neighbor by treating him disrespectfully. And it's interesting the commands that he chooses to illustrate this point. You don't dishonor your neighbor in an adulterous relationship. You don't dishonor your neighbor by getting angry and taking your neighbor's life. You don't steal from your neighbor. You don't covet from your neighbor. Everything you do is done out of love. So I don't have to find within my neighbor a reason that is inborn within him or her to show this love. I show this love because God showed this love to me. And what that all means then is that the reason I love my neighbor is because it's a demonstration of my love for God. Looking to the book of Leviticus, where this command was given within the law of Moses, Moses said this: you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Why do I love my neighbor? I love my neighbor because I love God. How do I show my love for God? I lovingly obey His commands. What is one of the commands God gives me? Treat everybody in a good and honorable and loving kind of way. So when we put all of this in context, what do we find? Loving my neighbor is linked without breakage to my love of God. And because of God's love for me, in showing me that in His eyes I have value, I take that precious gift that I've been given, and however I can, I show that to those around me. The greatest commandment: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. When I understand and practice these loves, then I understand how I can show my love for God. Thank you so much for joining in and listening to the sermon today. I encourage you to join with me in praying for our nation, that our leaders will have wisdom as they begin to reopen, that those who have been infected with this virus can be healed from it, and those who have lost family members can be comforted. But most of all, let's join together in praying that we can understand the love we need to show for God and the strength that we need to show this love for our neighbor. Again, thank you for joining us today.